role do you think the New South Wales government can play in ensuring supermarkets move beyond audits to a real-time compliance and worker grievance mechanism?
It is, look, the role of those retailers at the upper end has a very significant impact, and that was really brought home. There was a visit a few years ago by a US prosecutor who raised the case in Florida where tomato pickers were getting ripped off, and I expected him to say, well, you know, the way we solved this was we just went in and we prosecuted, and he went, no, it was the fact that retailers at the top end of the chain were eventually pressured to actually put pressure down the supply chain to actually only accept tomatoes from employers doing the right thing. And, you know, the prosecutions, you get too few of them. I mean, the judicial system is slow, uncertain, and a lot of workers, I mean, there is a power differential, but one of the things we find, even when workers are at the point of disengaging, saying, well, I've had enough, I'm going to leave, and you sort of say, well, now you've got nothing to lose, they just go, I'm not willing to spend months going through an Australian judicial process for an uncertain outcome. So the motivation is there. So I think, you know, anything in New South Wales, you asked me what levers to pull, that's going to be much harder as to what legislatively you could do. I mean, obviously, excess of reliability, so pushing it, allowing, you know, pursuit up the supply chain, which was done with clothing workers, you know, so you had the homework legislation that allows outworkers, home workers in the clothing industry to sue up the supply chain to claim back. That would be one way to put them more on the hook. But it's difficult to do. I mean, there is excess or reliability already. I mean, there have been some successful cases. The trolley collectors, for example, was a case where those supermarket chains were held to account for it. I mean, you heard from Woolworths today. I think they are making some efforts, but we would certainly have pushed them to give greater willingness to give some preference to the PALM scheme because of the extra safeguards that are there, because the employers on that scheme are actually vetted by DUA against you know, having a history of exploitation or illegal activity.
And you note that sometimes the migrant temporary workers are required to drive, but they're not given access to driver education. Should this be a condition for employers who require workers to drive to actually provide that driver education?
Absolutely, without a doubt, that should be the case.
We've had approved employers that actually do that off their own back, and the outcomes for those improved employers that do it off their own back are so much more beneficial. I see it on the ground every day. The workers that have had an employer that has said, I am committed to the welfare of our workforce, and I'm going to make sure that you don't drive a car until you've had some training, is really beneficial. The roads in the Pacific, I mean, Fiji is the only country with traffic lights. The rest of them don't even have traffic lights. I was driving one day with a Solomon Islander who said to me, hey boss, can I just double check something with you? And I said, yes. And he said, when you get to the traffic lights, the red means stop, eh? I just want to double check before I drive. He was meant to be driving that afternoon. Obviously I didn't let him drive. I let somebody, one of our more experienced Fijian workers that was there, drive, and we got him some training before we let him drive. But he theoretically is holding on to a Solomon Island driver's license. If that was a change that could be made, yeah, that would be beneficial, 100%.
The other point to make there is there are some cases that are still very rare, but still being brought to our attention where workers, if a worker is required to drive, then they should be paid for it. So it's different where the employer gives them a minibus and says, well, this is, you know, sort it out for yourselves who's coming to work. Well, that's probably no different to the rest of us who don't get paid to drive to work. But where you'd say to someone, you're actually the designated driver and you have the obligation to bring people to and from work, that's an employment situation. We're pretty clear that the Fair Work Ombudsman would cover that if they're not being paid. So,
and sometimes there's tension between, say, the PALM's temporary design and, say, long-term workers' aspirations. What governance model would allow both, say, mobility for the workers, but retention in shortage sectors, so that they, you know, we're asking for schemes to be more mobile or flexible, but they don't. It doesn't appear to be the case.
So we're supportive of extra mobility, portability on the scheme. The challenge you've got, though, looking at the design, one of the design features is to make the scheme highly accessible to people from very impoverished backgrounds in the Pacific. And the way it does that is it gets the employer to pay all the upfront costs. Right. So currently the scheme design is the employer has to put a lot of effort into bringing a worker out. It has to pay the upfront costs. Yes, they get repaid over a 16-week period. Now, you are going to disincentivise employers to be on the scheme if you say, well, after day 2, the worker turns up and says, well, I'm no longer going to work for you, I'm going to go down the guy down the road. Even if they get the debt repaid, the employer has still had to do a lot of work to bring that worker out and now doesn't have the worker they need to fulfil that. So that's one of the challenges around portability. Now, there are solutions to that. You could say, well, maybe the Commonwealth picks up the debt of bringing the worker out to keep that accessibility to the scheme going, and therefore the worker now owes the Commonwealth and has to repay if there's a repayment, or whether the Commonwealth just wants to do that as a freebie. That's a call on the government's revenue to make that happen. That would be one way. But you then need to think through the consequences of some of that as well. So, for example, does that mean employers who, like I would see employers currently who, because of the debt, actually feel a greater obligation to make sure the worker wants to stay with them and put a lot more effort in. Now, if the worker can just freely move, the employer might go, well, I can just treat you however I like, and if you leave, that's okay. I'll just ask the Commonwealth to bring someone else out and pay for them to fill the gap I've now got. So you'd need to think carefully about the design is what we'd raise. I don't know if others want to add to that.
And we've heard from councils earlier that they're not advised about, workers coming in and things like that. So would you endorse council access to, say, worker arrival data? And if so, what specific details do you think should be shared with councils to allow them to plan for that worker arrival and the community support?
I think I can start and then perhaps Mel can share. At the moment, the data is not being shared.
No.
So we would like to ask, the state government to work with the federal governments to provide the data, of people when they come in, and where and how, so that we can all come in. I think you asked earlier of the community connection in the space and how long. Because of our relationship working together with the community, we can only access to the data that's been given to us through the approved employer sometimes. And that depends on the relationship that we have already fostered over the years. But the data need to be spread so that the whole community work together. I think that that's the challenge for this program to be successful, is that we wait, to be told, for my case, to be called in when trouble is happening, rather than being called in, to work with the workers from the beginning, continuously, even to the reintegration period, because that's the whole time, and we can do that, as a community together, but the data is not being given to us. So I think from the state level, it needs to work with the federal. Any data that comes out to the state is to spread,